Hello, welcome Mariano, welcome Roger. It's great to see you here, and welcome everybody. This is day 6 of the World Happiness Week, presented by the World Happiness Fest and the World Happiness Foundation. And today we are all in. We go into economy, into public policy, into governance. We want to go deeper. We learned so much over the week from happiness at work and how to make companies and work a force for good to health and the importance of mental health and the policy making that we need, to eradicate the stigma on mental health. Then we've been focusing on education, and we've been discovering education systems at work and new frameworks and support that we need for the education environments. The day 4, we connected the self and the planet, and we talk about the science of spirituality. We were all in this case and beyond in order to connect the dots of humanity. Yesterday, we went and we built this pearl necklace through technology. So yesterday was all about what is the role of technology in everything we do with TransTech. And today, this is the day where we bring everything together into the economics of happiness. And if there is somebody who knows about this, is Mariano, because you are the author of the Economics of Happiness, this amazing book. And if there is somebody that can bring some futuristic and very well needed replacement to measurement, is Ruyer, with the whole concept of replacing GDP. So what we are going to be doing now, we are going to have about 50 minutes, and we are going to go deeper into the economics of happiness and into replacing GDP. And with that, we are going to frame the day. Then the rest of the day, we have John Hollowell. He's going to be presenting the World Happiness Report 2021. We have Jeffrey Sachs, who is going to be talking also about sustainability. We have impact investment. We have Philip Kotler, the father of modern marketing, saying, well, what I've done so far with marketing wasn't that good for the world. So how can we get back to reality and build more sustainable societies? But let's start today saying thank you, Roger and Mariano, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Happy to be here.
So I would love to actually start with Mariano. Mariano, you've been working in the space of economics of happiness for so long. You are really the reference in many ways for so many people and for so many economics. And I would love to start understanding and getting some insights of what's going on. You remember last year we met almost at the same time, 1 year of pandemic. It was closing down. Now it's 12 months later. But can we start basically with your insights around what are the economies of happiness and what has changed over the pandemic?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Since this is the first presentation on this day of economics and happiness, I would like to go a little bit back to history. Basically, economists are very important when we talk about public policy. When we talk about the future, there is always this term, this word, development. We care about development, we care about progress, and economists are always there. You always want to have one economist when you are talking about development. But I think that the main problem is that most of the economists you will find were trained in a different paradigm, in what I call the 20th century paradigm of progress as economic growth. And then I would like to go a little back in history and to provide in these 10, 12 minutes a perspective of how the economics of happiness emerges and comes and dominates now this idea of, look, we have to take a different perspective when we talk about progress, when we talk about development. But I don't know if I can share some slides. I have here the share, I guess this is share screen. And let's see if I learn how share screen. I think it should be very easy if I find my presentation somewhere here. If not, I will just talk, but let me see. Sharing, I don't know whether.
Yeah, you are sharing. You are
I'm
sharing
sharing.
your full now you are saying your screen.
Okay, now let's go to my presentation.
Perfect.
And this is my presentation. It's something quick, but it's about the history of the economics of happiness. First of all, what I said, it is very important always to have this idea of the context. I know that many psychologists, some coaches emphasize the skills, the abilities, I say to swim, to navigate in life, to go through life, and you need a lot of skills. But it is also very important to have a perspective of the context. And I say, even if you are a good swimmer, even if you are the best swimmer in the world, it is much better to navigate in tranquil waters, no, like this peaceful river you have in the left, rather than in turbulent waters. And economics is about this context. And this context is important even for people who are good swimmers, and I mean by people, for people who have the skills, the abilities, like resilience, like mindfulness. That's important. But even with those skills, it is better to have a good context. And that's what economics and economists are about, providing a context that is also supportive of a happy life. And this is not something new in economics. When you go to the 19th century, the 18th century, you will find that economists were concerned or care about happiness. You can find beautiful words by Adam Smith about the importance of happiness, a happy life. He was a philosopher and he talked a lot about a good life and a happy life. Jeremy Bentham was also an economist, very concerned about promoting happiness. He even proposed a happiness calculator, no, to compute the happiness of people and to guide public policy using some happiness criteria. So happiness was there. Happiness was important for economics. But something happened in the 20th century. It was a century of science as hard science, objectivism, the idea that you have to provide objective measures of everything, not subjective measures, the idea that you could create mathematical models as sophisticated as those used by hard science like physics or chemistry. And then during the 20th century, we got into this idea of focusing not on happiness, but on choice, on how people take decisions and how they spend their money. And then the focus moved from happiness to money, to income. And there was this idea that income was a good proxy for people's happiness, well being. Also, this idea that more income always implies more happiness. This direct, simple relationship was there. Something else that I think is very important, we reduce persons to consumers. And then everything was about purchasing power, not about the happiness of people, but about their purchasing power, whether they were able to buy commodities. And then we forgot about a lot of other aspects in economics. This is what we have in the 20th century, a model that emphasizes a paradigm of development that emphasizes objects, productivity, that emphasizes commodities, but that forgets about the happiness of people. And the problem is that most economists you have today, those who were trained in the 1990s, 1980s, and 1970s, and their students, most of their students trained in the early decades of this millennium, they were trained with this perspective. What we care or what economics is about economic growth, about people having purchasing power to buy commodities, and that was the idea of progress in the 20th century. That was predominant. You can ask economists, and they will say, well, yes, I took 3 courses on economic growth models, and my main task is to increase productivity, to make the economy grow, to have a greater GDP per capita. That was the economics of the 20th century. And I have to say, this is important, and probably Roger will mention this later on, that even in the 20th century, there were a lot of economists who said, look, be careful. GDP is not a good proxy of well-being. Even Simon Kuznets. Simon Kuznets was the creator of the GDP. He's considered the father of the GDP. And in 1934, this was when he was working in creating the GDP index. He says something like, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. Other economists like Moses Abramovich and others, they said, be careful. GDP is a good measure of production, but that's not a good measure of progress in society. It is not a good measure of well-being in society. And it is famous, this Robert Kennedy speech is famous. No, I will not read it. You can find it in the web. But he says something like, GDP measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. In other words, there are more important things that we are missing when we focus too much on GDP. And if we think about economic growth models, we will be missing a lot of important things for life. No? So this is important because in 1974, this economist, Richard Easterling, asked himself the following question: does economic growth really increases happiness? And he provides something that is very important. He provides an empirical paper. This is not a speech. This is not just an essay. This is empirical research about whether economic growth increases happiness. And his answer is no. Skepticism was right. We have to be careful. There may be situations where economic growth can contribute to happiness, but you should not assume that more income implies greater happiness. And this is the beginning of the economics of happiness. After this 1974 paper, in the 1990s, more economists start studying happiness, and we have now a branch in economics that is about the study of happiness, whether people report being happy, being satisfied with life. I have some data here that shows this is Egypt, and you see here that the GDP was rising, but the percentage of people thriving was declining. So this is a common finding. We find many countries over time where economic growth is there, GDP is growing, but there is no increase in happiness. So It is true, GDP or income does not necessarily imply greater happiness. There are many factors, and economists have been studying now why this is not happening. We find out, and you mentioned Philip Kotler, Luis. Philip Kotler has a very nice interview where he says something like, yes, we push people to buy a lot of things, and GDP is growing, but their happiness is not increasing. Why? Because what we are doing is we have more income, but also we raise aspirations. Material aspirations are also increasing, and then people do not feel satisfied. They have more, but they want more. They are not happier. And there are many reasons that imply that happiness is not associated to income. And also, we found out that there are other factors that are important in life. For example, family, friends, having free time, good leisure, no? Your sense of community, your neighbors, the community you live, your spiritual life. And these factors are not related to income. Income may be important for your economic satisfaction, but it is not so important for your family or friendship satisfaction. That's why you can have more income, but no more happiness. And if you want to have more happiness, you should look not only at income, but at other drivers that are important for family life, for friendship, for enjoying your leisure time, or your free time, for having a sense of community, and so on. And we have found out that happiness, studying happiness, is very important even to understand behavior. We find out that when societies are not happy, there is political and social unrest. There are political movements, and this happens in many countries, Chile, Tunisia. We find out, and this is important for policy, for politicians, that electoral results depend on happiness. The probability of the official party of winning the election depends on whether people are happier or not with that government. So happiness is very important for politicians who care about re-election. But happiness is also important to understand a lot of human decisions, whether people change jobs, they quit their job, even if they earn a lot of money, they prefer to have a job that is satisfying, and they move from one job to another, striving for happiness. They migrate looking for happiness. People divorce, marriage, and so on, and run their family firms and their enterprises because they want to, or they look for happiness. So what do we have now? The new economists are now exposed to this idea of, look, there is more in life than income. You have a new paradigm. You should care more about happiness, less about economic growth. You have to be also environmentally friendly. We need a progress, social progress, that is not only about creating more happiness in the present, but also concerned about the happiness of people in the future. And now we are working in public and private policy for that. And I believe this day, the following people you will be talking with will get into these issues of public and private policies for happiness. So that's what I wanted to share with you, Luis, and the rest of the group here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mariano. Before we move into Roger, maybe I can ask you one question, and then we'll have time for more questions after Roger. But do you think that COVID has had an impact on your thinking about the economics of happiness? It reinforced what you think about?
Probably, yeah. I think that will be a very good question for John Helliwell, who will be presenting data on COVID. But I think that COVID tells us is that there is something in the way we value activities, we value commodities that is not working well. Doesn't make sense for a banker to earn a lot of money, and then you have a doctor, a nurse who is there in a hospital exposed every day to COVID, doing goodness and not receiving the reciprocity. I don't mean monetary money, but the reciprocity, social value that they deserve. No, this is something that Pope Francis already mentioned. Look, these are heroes, and we are not recognizing the social value of their activities. And then you see other activities where money is created a lot. No, so there is something, and actually that's a very important theoretical issue in economics that we call the theory of value. How do you know something has value or not? And I think COVID is telling us there is something wrong with the way we value activities and we value commodities. That's a challenge for future economists to address the theory of value.
Thank you so much, Mariano. We can go deeper into that. Let's go to Roger. You've been studying for so many years GDP, and now you have a way to replace it. So why don't we learn about that?
Yes. Yes, thanks a lot, Luis, and thanks a lot, Mariano, also for this introduction into the well-being work that you've done. Let me just share my screen and also my perspective on how I would like to discuss this. Let's see. Are you seeing the screen, hopefully? Are you seeing the screen, Luis?
Not yet.
Okay. Let me share. Oh, application window. Yep. Are you seeing it now?
Yeah, now we see that.
Okay, great. Yeah, just as an introduction to myself, I'm the founder of Metrics for the Future, so measuring beyond GDP and beyond profit. I also have an investors platform, and I've been working with many international institutes on this topic. My perspective perhaps is slightly different, and that's why it's probably nice that we are that I'm in kind of a complementary space to Mariano. I think actually the science is behind kind of a well-being economy or happiness economics. The science is very much behind us that, you know, there's more to life than money, as Mariano clearly showed. There's also this aspect of sustainability, and I think equity is another aspect which is crucially important. And I think also perhaps just from a spiritual perspective, I think we also have the upper ground, right? There's no philosopher or religious text that has ever said that the way to salvation or to a good life is basically to accumulate as much money as you want. But then if you adopt that thinking, then from a scientific perspective and even from a philosophical and perhaps from a heart perspective, we are, we have the better story. But then why for 50 years or so have we been unable really to make a very big impression? I think, as Mariano said, there's been economists that has been criticizing GDP growth for decades, really, and we've had the limits to growth in 72, Kuznets back in 34, Brundtland report on sustainable development in 87. So the part that I want to bring basically to the discussion is that perhaps rather than the scientific argument and the heart argument, it's also good to think about power. In a sense, we're also in competition with certain other ideas. For example, the fact that GDP growth is the goal of society. And perhaps we should also be thinking a little bit in terms of, well, how do we get that message out to as many people as possible? And how do we really shape society? And so basically in my publications, such as the book that you see here, I've been focusing very much actually on the institutionalization. How do you actually get an idea like this across? Because I feel so many people, so many brilliant scientists and philosophers have already told us that this is not the route that we need, GDP growth. But why then are we failing to get that message across? Or why is it going too slowly, I would say? And so I'm actually going to show only one slide of a new project that we have, where we've actually taken 5 pillars of transformation. And these are actually the 5 pillars that I think are really fundamental to understand also why economists after the Second World War became so powerful in shaping society. So I'm just going to go through them, but perhaps it's good just to first explain the WISE acronym. WISE stands for the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. So there's the well-being of the current generation. There's the sustainability of future generations. Can they continue to thrive in the way that we would want to? And then there's, of course, also an equity dimension where there is equity disparities within countries, but I think also very much in terms of global disparities. So I think, these are the 3 core dimensions which just about every book on this topic really covers. And so then the question is, how can we get this message across? And the first aspect is this idea of narratives. Mariano clearly pointed out that the economic narrative is very much, firstly, that the economy is important. So, you shift your focus of attention, you shift that to the central to the central stage. So that's one of the aspects of the narrative. The second aspect of the narrative is, of course, that economic growth is basically always good. And we've just seen that in many cases there is a relationship between income and well-being, but it's a very complex relationship where other things are also very, very important. And the third aspect is also something that was raised, is that it also kind of shapes the vision that we have of people as economic agents only. So we are consumers, we are workers, we are investors. So it very much shapes our idea of human activity and human, human goals, really. So what we would need in terms of, an alternative is to actually say, well, all dimensions of WISE, so well-being, sustainability, and equity, are all important. And it's only improvement. You can really only speak of progress if all of those are improve at the same time. So if well-being is increasing but sustainability is problematic, then that's not a good development. Or if well-being on average is increasing, but a small portion of the population is really suffering, then that's inequitable. And I think what we also need is a narrative where people become citizens and ancestors in the story, rather than just economic agents in an economic system. So this is the first dimension of this transformation. And to be quite frank, I think we are really well covered in this domain. I mean, I think everybody probably has a favorite book on happiness economics. And there have been many since last 40 or 50 years. But I would argue that they basically all argue more or less these narrative arguments, and there might be slight differences, but I would say that this is very much kind of the core of what is being argued. So the second dimension where economists have done really, really well is that they've created kind of an economic language. So it's kind of a secret language which economists have, where they've defined GDP, and that's used all over the world. They've defined consumption, investments, productivity, value added. All these things are defined really clearly in a global accounting framework that we call the System of National Accounts. And the great thing about that is that when economists then talk to each other, they immediately understand what they're talking about and what they're discussing. And a lot of these terms have also gone beyond the economic realm and then gone into journalism and to the general population. Where in our own community, there is a huge amount of terminology. I've listed just a couple here, but there are many, many, many ways of describing well-being, sustainability, and equity in some shape or form. And so I do think we also need to think about, can we be more clear in terms of the terminology, and can we perhaps also harmonize some of these terms? Because I don't believe that we're sending, from a marketing perspective, a very clear message to the rest of society. The third aspect is, of course, these statistics. That's what this GDP, of course, symbolizes, that there are so many economic statistics and they're really frequent and fast. So GDP is published every quarter and 1 month after every quarter. So it's fast. There's GDP data for decades. And so the coordination is really fantastic. While on the other side, the wise statistics, it is rarer. Usually it's on an annual basis, although there is more faster data coming up. And generally speaking, I think beyond GDP statistics are quite slow at the moment, and we really need to think of ways of speeding it up. Now, the fourth pillar of, I think, what economists bring to society is that they don't just look at the past, they look at the future as well. They provide policymakers with a tool, models and tools with which to make decisions. So policymakers have some really tough decisions to make, and economists basically say, well, if you want to grow the economy, I have a couple of models that might help you in your decision making. And I've named just a couple here. Now, I think in our space, there are, of course, a couple of great examples of climate models, biodiversity models. So there is some work being done, but there is no comprehensive model, for example, which develops a model on well-being, sustainability, and equity on all dimensions of that discussion. So I do think we need to work there as well. And the final point is that what has made economists so successful after the Second World War is that they've really been able to institutionalize their models, their statistics, their language, and their narratives into all areas of society. So they've been really successful, and I don't think we should be critical necessarily. We should actually be in awe of how powerful this kind of mainstream economics has become. And we should basically learn from this type of development. And so in our United Nations University project, these are the 5 pillars that we'll be working on. And so to wrap it up, Luis, I do think actually that sometimes in the Beyond GDP community, we tend to think, well, basically the whole task of Beyond GDP is to simply measure other statistics. But I do actually believe that the history of economic thinking after the Second World War is also thinking about the power, how to really, get these ideas into governments, into society, into our newspapers, and into the media. And that's what, our project at the United Nations University will hope to achieve. I've stopped sharing, Luis.
Thank you so much, Roger. This is fantastic. And I would add, actually, that we have 2 resolutions coming from the United Nations that encourage all of us to actually go in this direction of narratives, language. One is a resolution about International Day of Happiness, and the second one is actually about creating new paradigms for human progress. So I feel that, like you, that we have so many ingredients already on the table. So where do you start? I mean, I know that you are right now building the project, but in your mind, if there is one way, one thing that should be the beginning, what is it from your point of view?
I actually think it's one theme is collating all the knowledge that we have at the moment. I think all the statistics are there, all the modeling expertise is there. There's a lot of willingness amongst governments as well. I really, we have the example of the We Go governments, which are well-being economy governments, and we have New Zealand. But I think the group of governments that are willing to discuss these things is actually much larger. So my belief is really that it's far more a question of harmonizing the thinking that we have and providing kind of not one coherent, but a coherent solution, I think, to all these different fields. One of the things that I've been thinking about is journalists, right? I've been looking at the New York Times about how many times GDP is mentioned in the New York Times, and it's just flabbergasting. Like two times a day, the word gross domestic product, the whole word comes up in the New York Times. Things like the SDGs hardly ever turn up, maybe a dozen times a year or so. So why is that? And I think it might be just as simple that journalists are under a lot of stress to produce an article. They won't know what GDP is, and then they see that there's a dozen beyond GDP alternatives, and they don't have time to research all of these things. But there's enough journalists, I'm pretty sure, that are willing to go into this, but we're not making it very easy for them by providing 12 of these. So just providing, for example, a MOOC, just a 1-hour course on what are the various beyond GDP metrics that you could use, where are the databases that you could find the data, that would be solving a problem for journalists who are in fact willing to go into this area. So sometimes the solutions, I don't think, are very complex. We really need to think of what problems do people have to adopt these things, and how can we help them?
So Mariano, what do you think? I feel that Roger's approach is very, very practical. Do you think that we can build on Roger's framework from your experience? There might be something still missing from your point of view of working with economics of happiness for so long.
Well, I agree. We need to provide some coherence. There is a famous paper by Harry Johnson. Harry Johnson was a famous economist in the 1960s, and he has a paper about how to make a counter-revolution. And he was talking about the revolution of monetarists against Keynesians, but how to make a counter-revolution. And this does not happen sporadically. You have to organize. And I would like to emphasize that I've been in this for more than 2 decades. And I remember when you said, I'm studying happiness, and people look at you, you are a weird person, no? That was 20 years ago, no? Now you can say I'm an economist of happiness, and that's fine, no? So I think we have made progress. I would say these revolutions take time. You cannot do that in 5 years. You can contribute, and it will take maybe 10, 15 more years. What is important is that there is also a grassroots movement. I was involved with OECD like 15 years ago when they started with this project measuring the progress of societies. And I remember that we said this is good, but what is important is not to have a big institution. What is important is that there are a lot of small groups everywhere in the world, that are demanding this change and this shift. And that's also something that we need to incorporate in any transformation, that there is a grassroots movement, and somehow we need to involve them here. And also, I think one of the major bottlenecks is that we need to go to graduate schools and start teaching happiness economics, because most of the people who are advisors of politicians, they were trained with the old paradigm. And we usually go to politicians, and politicians tell us, what you say is perfect. I completely understand you. But when I ask my advisors to provide some insight, it's always about productivity, economic growth, opening the economy. So that bottleneck, which is we need to train the future staff in public and also private companies. And at least they should be exposed to the notion of happiness, because there is this typical bias of going back to your area of comfort. If in your graduate studies you did not hear about happiness, you say, better not to get into this because it was not in my PhD program, my master program. I think that's a bottleneck that we need to face. And also we need more theory, as Roger said. We need to move from those 30 seconds in the TV news program that take place at the last 30 seconds, when they have like a joke and they say something like, Costa Rica is the happiest country in the world, let's go to the beaches. No, those are 30 seconds. But when you are talking about Wall Street, you have 5 minutes in the middle of the program. Why? Because it's not only about a rise or a fall in the Dow Jones. It's also an explanation, a model, a forecast. And that's what we also need, to have those 5 minutes in the news and not only the last 30 seconds of the joke. So those are my comments. I completely agree with the perspective. Yeah.
Roger, you want to build on this?
Yeah, especially the education part, I think, is so important, because if you keep training economists in the same way, you'll get the same results. And so, yeah, also in this UN project, we will be very much looking also at education, and there are wonderful groups out there, where actually even students are demanding that they get a broader vision of models, because students, that are studying economics want to solve problems as well. When I'm an environmental economist, but when I started studying environmental economy, I didn't want to study economics. I wanted to solve environmental problems. So students are actually demanding that their curricula actually changes, and I think that's really vitally important. That's one of the institutions. If you would target one institution, education probably be one of the first to tackle. I'm sometimes quite optimistic when it comes to COVID, but perhaps, I don't know whether you guys know Danny Roderick. He's a really great economist on globalization and a very contrarian economist, I think, in many fields. And he actually says, crises actually galvanize things that were changing anyway. So I think, as Mariano said, there is already this shift that you feel that well-being economics and happiness economics is gaining traction. You can see it with sustainability. You can see it with the discussions about equity, where billionaires are profiting off the, basically inequalities are increasing during the Corona crisis. So I'm quite optimistic that some things will change and we will regress some other things. I must say the reasons why that might change is sometimes perhaps slightly more cynical than the idealistic version. So, for example, the financial crisis last time, we all complained that basically there was not a green recovery after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The opportunity was missed really to really invest in sustainable technology and recovery then. And I think we have a much better chance now. And from the idealistic perspective, you would say, well, that's because Greta Thunberg and the climate marches have really raised awareness of climate change and the great damages that we're doing. But at the same time, something else has happened, and that is, and in those 10 or 11 years, renewables have become like 80% cheaper. Electrical vehicles will become on par with ICE vehicles in 2 to 3 years or so. So actually, any politician now that is not arguing for green recovery is, even from an economic perspective, a very quite a dumb politician, really. And so I don't care how that sustainability comes about, but I don't think we should always interpret these things only from an idealistic perspective, but there are also, economic perspectives going in our way, actually, hopefully. So.
Thank you so much. Can we go a bit deeper into cases? Because something that really helps people understand is when we talk about, okay, this is going on in this place and it's working. So I think that New Zealand is one of those countries that is taking happiness and well-being in a kind of serious way. I still remember the Minister of Finance in Dubai. We were together, Mariano, there that year when they were actually working with the OECD on bringing the well-being framework link to the budget. So what do you think, Mariano, about New Zealand? Is New Zealand one of the closest examples to what we think and we talk when we mention the economics of happiness and well-being?
Well, there is interest in happiness everywhere. No, I think, and I would like to emphasize, just before answering the New Zealand case, emphasize this research that shows that happiness is a better predictor of electoral results than GDP. Because as Roger said, politicians basically care about re-election. No? We may be idealist, and that's important also. Ideas are very important, as Keynes said. But we also have to recognize that we are in a world where politicians take their calculator and they think in terms of votes and the next election. They are short-sighted. They don't think about 2050, no, the 3 decades from now, no, 21st, 50. They are thinking about the next elections. But we have results that show, look, if you are a politician, behave as a politician, okay, but be concerned about the happiness of people because that's important for your party. And then I think that you will find everywhere with this message that politicians start caring about happiness, taking a look at happiness. And there are some countries that have always been very progressive on this regard. And you have New Zealand that is trying to incorporate some ideas, some notions of happiness into the budget, at least in a qualitative way, not a quantitative way. Also, South Korea has been concerned about happiness. Even China is now talking about happiness in the new plan, no? 14 development plan. They are talking about the happiness of Chinese. So governments are there. And we have to tell politicians, this is good for you, not because you are an idealist, but because you care about winning. And also we need to provide something, and that's the role of the academic sector, to provide not only coefficients, but a framework that tells what I mentioned, the 5 minutes in the middle of the TV program, a whole understanding of this is what you can do. It's not only about economic growth, it's also about the kind of education you have, financing hospitals, no? Prevention is very important, health prevention. So what kind of programs, what kind of policies? No? That's what we are doing now. Usually I talk about 3 phases or 3 stages in the development of happiness. The first stage was to position happiness as an academic issue. That was very difficult. 20 years ago, my colleagues were very reluctant about talking about happiness in economics. Second stage was to introduce happiness in national statistical offices. We did that 10 years ago. I remember there were some meetings with national statistical offices, and they accepted, sometimes reluctant, but they accepted the idea you can measure life satisfaction. Subjective measures are important. And the third stage we are now is moving to policy. So I think we need to provide something. I hope in the academic sector we can do that in the next 10 years to have those models, those predictors, and policies that work. And that's what we are doing now. That's the third stage. And there is always a fourth stage, which is to learn from our mistakes, because we will make mistakes. You can take a look at those who are promoting economic growth. They've been trying to promote economic growth for 5-6 decades, and they have not been successful. So to make mistakes is part of life. We will make mistakes, and we need to correct them and learn from the mistakes, because in the end, our goal is not to place happiness in the political arena. Our final goal is for people to be happy, for citizens of the world to be happy. And so we will have to learn from our mistakes and enhance our programs. I hope in 10, 20 years, we will have a different world, thanks to these 4 stages.
Love it. So is New Zealand an example? Leading Mariano, do you see New Zealand making mistakes, or do you see them actually doing it right? I mean, what is the state? Because they are very publicly open and talking about it.
I think they are doing right because they also have a democracy and they can discuss the topics. No, that's also important, to learn that there are different perspectives, that you are proposing a different paradigm, little by little introducing that and discussing. You need to involve everybody in society. It's not just a technical matter. We cannot, as Roger says, this is not a sophisticated language. In the end, this is a language that everybody in society, every citizen should understand. And New Zealand has also that advantage. It's a good democracy, and they can discuss the issues. And so it's an experiment at the moment. I would not say this is a case study, it's an experiment. Let's see how it works and what we need to learn from them and from other countries, as I said. Even Mexico is right now talking about happiness, measuring happiness. Actually, Mexico measures happiness quarterly. Every quarter, we have data on the happiness of Mexicans. The problem is that at the moment, we don't know how we can use that data to design policies. That's a task we're working now as scholars in the academic sector, to propose policies for politicians to use.
Thank you so much, Mariano. So, Richard, we have 1 minute for you and 1 minute for Mariano. So what is your key message?
The key message. Well, I wanted just to say about the New Zealand thing. One of the great things is that it's actually the Minister of Finance as well, right? So although Jacinda Ardern should have a lot of credits, it's also really interesting that a Minister of Finance, like Mariano says, 20 years ago, just imagine a Minister of Finance committing to well-being budget, that, you know, perhaps the credit rating of New Zealand would have dropped. And now we are kind of used to this idea that he has there. The second aspect is, what I find interesting is that the Ministry of Finance is full of really clever people. And if you focus the clever people on developing economic growth models, they'll do that. But if politicians simply say, well, listen, guys, you're really clever, think of ways of creating well-being policies. There's so much creativity and knowledge in those kind of ministries and institutions that we can actually change perhaps more rapidly than we think.
Thank you so much, Roger. So another key message.
For me?
Yes, for you. And then we close with Mariano.
Yeah, let's work together rather than so heterogeneously towards this transformation that we need.
Mariano, you close this panel.
I always say that happiness is about coming closer to people, not to scholars, not to Nobel Prize winners. No, it's for economists to face this challenge and for all professionals to come closer to ordinary people in the highlands, in the valleys, close to the rivers, the real concrete people. And that's why we ask people, are you satisfied with life? And that answer is very important because we face the challenge of providing an explanation to the answer of concrete people. So I would like for this movement, which is growing and growing and growing, never to forget that in the end it's about ordinary people. That's what we want. Not the orthodoxy of these revolutionary movements. In the end, they do not know what they are pursuing. No, let's not forget the real people who are walking there, fishing, taking their kids to school. Those are the people we care about. And we need to move theory and to shift development paradigms to make some impact on people. So that's it. And just 30 seconds to say thank you. I learned from Ed Dinner that it's good for your happiness to say thank you. So thank you to Roger and to Luis, who's done an amazing job. I remember when we first met a long time ago in Miami, and he's done an amazing job. So thank you, Luis. You are a key player and an excellent person here.
Well, thank you. Just as good as you, my friends. So thank you so much, Roger. Your project is very important, as you know. Right now, you can really, and we'll be helping here, bringing people together as much as you need because you are framing something very important. And then I take Mariano's that this is for all. So there is something I like to say is that stop making people happy. Just basically don't make them unhappy. So let's create the conditions not to make people happy, and then we'll teach and we'll show how to leverage happiness and well-being from an individual point of view. Thank you so much. It was fantastic, and now we are going to move into the next segment. So see you soon, and thank you again for your amazing contribution.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.